In Under Construction, you explore the intersection of development and governance by examining the conflicts surrounding the construction of specific infrastructural technologies in Ethiopia, such as asphalt versus cobblestone roads, motorcycle taxis, and hydroelectric dams. You argue that these projects serve as sites for nation building and the means for the state to assert its legitimacy. You also examine the tension and conflict between the promise of progress and the possibility of failure through these construction projects. Now, in the economic literature, Ethiopia, especially for the last 10 years or so, is highlighted as a relatively successful story in Africa. Can you give us an introduction to Ethiopia's strategy of achieving rapid economic development through massive state investment projects in infrastructure? What kind of development projects are we talking about here? And how does it relate to other cases in Africa? Like, what makes Ethiopia unique or different than others?
Yeah, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me, Farad. Looking forward to this conversation, and also just hoping to learn from you as well about how economists are talking about and thinking about the Ethiopian case, because I think it's quite interesting. As you said, Ethiopia, in certain ways, particularly from a quantitative perspective related to economic growth, has been a quite striking success story in the context of Africa and then the global South more generally. Today, Ethiopia's GDP is around $84 billion, and just 10 years ago, 2010, it was around $30 billion. So you can see right there, that's a striking level of growth. Beginning around 2004, 2005, Ethiopia's GDP has grown by close to 10%, at least in that range every year. On certain years, it's been one of the fastest growing economies in the world. So it's really been impressive. And as a person who, when I first started studying Ethiopia, spending time there in the late 1990s, it was not something that I expected at that time, where it was really a country that was more associated with economic decline and stagnation. And its strategy for achieving this growth has been relatively unique and quite interesting as well. Ethiopia has one of the highest rates of public investment of funds into infrastructure in the world. So relative to its GDP, it invests a large amount of public money into the construction of infrastructure, usually in the past few years, one of the top 3 in the world in that category. And the former Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi, who was in power when many of these policies were started, he passed away, I believe, in 2012. He specifically expressed intentional rejection of what he called the Washington consensus, associated with more of a withdrawal of the state and neoliberal policies. Instead, really advocated what he called an activist state that would be heavily involved in economic growth and specifically investment in infrastructure. So hydroelectric dams are one of the key areas of investment. We'll talk, I'm sure, more about those because those are so important symbolically for Ethiopia, and they've also been the topics of a great deal of controversy as well. Roads, particularly asphalt roads, have been a major source of investment. So between 2010 to 2015, Ethiopia invested more than $7 billion in asphalt roads, which, keeping in mind that the GDP was around $30 billion in 2010, that's a really significant portion of their funds. Telecommunications have been expanded, rail lines have been built. There was a lot of journalistic international coverage of a metro line that was built within Addis Ababa, a new light rail in Addis Ababa. Also, more recently, major investments in industrial parks that are intended to attract international textile manufacturers. Also very important, particularly for young people, which was the topic of my first book, major expansions of universities. When I first started going to Ethiopia in the late 1990s, there was only 3 public universities for a population of around 60 million. In the past 20 years, more than 50 new universities have been constructed. So that creates all kinds of opportunities for young people to further their education, major investment in human capital. And with all of these infrastructural construction projects, they're direct generators of economic growth in the sense that they create huge amounts of jobs. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of jobs that are created through the building of infrastructure. So that in itself is very important. And also the contractors that carry out these projects are, many of them are local contractors, although there's a number of international companies involved as well. They're also profiting from this. In terms of Ethiopia's long-term plans to reach middle income status by the year 2025, the infrastructure is important because it really lays the groundwork for economic transformation. Having the hydroelectric dams provides a very cheap source of energy. The roads allows the export and the movement of resources as well as manufactured goods. The same with the trains. Telecommunications supports all that. Having an educated population supports all that. So much of that investment that has occurred in infrastructure has been through borrowing, through taking out loans. So the idea is that you take out these loans, you invest in this infrastructure, that allows the economic transformation that then would support long-term growth. At least that's the strategy that Ethiopia is hoping for. So far, it's been successful in generating that short-term growth, largely just due to the infrastructure building itself. Yet to be seen whether that long-term transformation will take place.
Which is very fascinating. And you mentioned that the Ethiopian government consciously adopted a more developmentalist perspective and rejected Washington consensus. In 1980s onwards, neoliberalism was the main ideological and economic policy in sub-Saharan Africa, as most of the rest of the world, both in the global north and the south. And Washington consensus, as it ended up being named, definitely advised a retrieval of the government from investments. And instead, in the 2000s, we had this shift of emphasis to institutions building. And most of sub-Saharan Africa could be included in that category, where the public investment and the government itself withdrew from investments and economic activities. How do you explain, what made Ethiopia different? What factors do you think contributed to? Of course, it's a very big, wide question, but I wonder, I'm just curious, what was unique, or what kind of, things came together in Ethiopia to enable the Ethiopian government, to have some kind of developmentalist autonomy so that they could undertake these development projects in infrastructure, in opposition to World Bank and IMF and also even the US State Department, right? Plus the neighbors, like the dam we'll talk more about, but it's, the building of them has been politically also has been quite challenging, including other regional players like Egypt and so on. So what made Ethiopia different? How could they adapt these infrastructure projects and perhaps reject or modify the Washington consensus?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's a difficult question as well. But first off, just to be clear, Ethiopia did implement structural adjustment policies during the 1990s and the early 2000s. They did things like currency devaluation, downsizing of the state and government. So it wasn't a complete rejection. But by the time you get to kind of the early 2000s, Ethiopia has developed a much closer relationship with China. And I think that that's a major influence in some of these policy decisions that the Ethiopian government was making, was a realization that there are other paths to development, and definitely following that Chinese model of investing in infrastructure with the hopes of starting kind of a textile manufacturing that can generate jobs through that as well in terms of a mode of growth. It's also interesting just in terms of the political history of Ethiopia. Ethiopia, of course, was ruled by a Marxist military dictatorship from 1974 to 1991. And with the coming of the EPDRF government, although they overthrew that dictatorship, that movement also had a great deal of roots in Marxism as well. And so particularly in the early years, they certainly did espouse a lot of Marxist ideology. And although that some of that ideology got a little bit, suppressed at different points in times, there was certainly a lot of pressure to adopt other types of reforms, like I mentioned with the downsizing of government. It still maintained that background was still there in many of the EPDRF leaders. So that also is a factor as well. Folks like Meles Zenawi were the key leaders of that movement. I mean, even today, land in Ethiopia is owned by the government. All land is nationalized. So even with more increasing privatization, there's still very much a strong place for the government in that context. And I should also point out that other scholars have certainly, there are neoliberal policies that have been implemented in Ethiopia. But if you compare to other African countries, as you said, you still see a very strong state that is really taking an active role in directing development, directing growth. Probably one of the countries that would be closest to Ethiopia, most similar, the comparisons often made is to Rwanda in terms of a very strong state and state-led economic policies. So that would be one other example on the continent where you do see some similarities. So I think it's really that partially the Chinese influence, as well as that just the ideological background that begins and goes back beyond the 1990s into the 80s, when the rebel group that eventually took power in the 1990s came out of that Marxist ideological background.
So it looks like, and I think this would definitely be a topic of its own, just to look at in another interview, perhaps. But the two factors: one is a strong state, which usually is highlighted in the economics literature as a necessary, not a necessary but not sufficient condition for a developmentalist policy, because without which you really cannot implement any policies. The second one is having alternative financing sources, and here I think China is offering a possibility, including that railroad building. And in my own research also, and many others highlight that availability of alternative sources is also a necessary but not sufficient condition, because China is present in many other countries also, from East Africa as well as Central Africa and also West Africa. And the way in which these countries link or take advantage of the Chinese financing is very different. So there's no one size fits all type. Unlike, say, World Bank, the Chinese lending is highly conditional on local capacity and local bargaining abilities. So in this case, I think it looks like the presence of a strong state enabled Ethiopian government to be able to leverage its position with respect to its lenders, including China.
No, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and that's fascinating. I personally find it very interesting, like what kind of local conditions or state capacity enables them, and what are the ways in which global South countries can maximize their gains from Chinese lending. That itself is, I think, a very fascinating question. And there's not much research done on that.
The long-term implications are still unclear, because if China lent all this money to Ethiopia to build infrastructure, much of that money was used to hire Chinese companies or to buy Chinese equipment. So that was, of course, beneficial for those companies. And now it's getting to a point where Ethiopia needs to repay some of those loans, and their ability to do so is really being questioned, because they need to attract foreign currency to really do that successfully. And currently, Ethiopia is embroiled in a civil war, and so the possibilities for repaying those loans they're facing some real difficulties. And the theory was that these industrial parks would generate manufacturing jobs, and that would support foreign investment. And they certainly have generated jobs, but they have not yet had the sort of success that would allow sort of the full-scale economic transformation and movement towards a manufacturing economy. So it's unclear what's going to happen now that these loans need to be repaid.
Right. I think the so-called debt trap is definitely a problem with any kind of foreign lending, including Chinese. And I think there's no Chinese exceptionalism in that part. But I think the part's also about knowledge transfer and know-how. Part was fascinating, like with the railroad, for example. It was all over the news at the time when it was signed, right? China was going to build it, but also was going to train local engineers and craftsmen to be able to operate it after 3 years. That, for example, is not universally shared either. In other countries, there's no such knowledge transfer necessarily. and there's significant differences, I think, between different types of FDI coming in. And many of them are tied also for, buyback guarantees from China. So it's definitely creating a market for Chinese products and investors. I think, I don't remember who said it, but when China means win-win, they mean they win twice. But that's true for most other foreign investors. But to change tracks, perhaps, because this is, again, as I said, is a topic of its own that deserves, I think, a lot more time than we have for today. But can you talk briefly about the interrelationship between this construction and destruction that you highlight in your book, especially referring to hydroelectric dams and roads? What is this creative destruction part, perhaps, if I would use growth terminology, that you are referring to here?
Yeah, well, I think I've already, in some ways, I've described the construction side of it, that you build things and that leads to a growth. It creates jobs, things that are generally seen as being desirable, particularly for developing countries. Through building infrastructure, you do create these opportunities. You build a dam that provides cheap electricity. Cheap electricity supports industry. Cheap electricity is also good for things like healthcare, education systems, just lighting people's houses, so many things like this. But then there's this whole other side of that construction, in the sense that it does lead to this destructive side, and definitely the idea of creative destruction is something that I get into in the book. We probably see this most clearly in the case of dams. Many of these major hydroelectric dams are being built in southern Ethiopia, around the peripheral areas of the country. These are parts of the country where the people, Ethiopia is a very ethnically diverse country, over 80 different languages spoken there. And these are parts of the country where more marginalized groups, minority groups that have historically had very little voice in the central government, or even local governance for that matter, live. More of these people are pastoralists as well, have had less engagement with formal education. And so the dams have led to displacement, which is often the case with hydroelectric dams. But beyond that, they've also destroyed livelihoods, in the sense that the people who live in these areas depend on the river and the flooding for seasonal agriculture, for water for their cattle. So it's estimated that close to 500,000 people will eventually have their livelihoods destroyed by these dams within southern Ethiopia. The dams also are being used to support irrigation. The irrigation is for large-scale cash crops, things like sugar and cotton. And so because of the state ownership of the land, it's very easy for the government to displace people from that land, actually forcibly resettle people to cities, villages, and then where they're really the only options are then working as wage laborers on these plantations, whereas previously they had their own land, which allowed them to be kind of economically self-sufficient and independent. So taking away the option of raising cattle, taking away the option of seasonal agriculture, and as a result, that's led to violence both between the state and the ethnic groups that are living in those areas, and between the ethnic groups themselves, as there's more conflict over resources, over cattle. It's a part of the country that historically has had very little kind of government presence. So most people are well armed, and they are ready to protect their own cattle, ready to protect their own water rights, and that's led to a large degree of conflict in those areas. Roads, and that's something that's one of these kind of controversies that's received a fair amount of international attention. I mean, roads do something similar, but at maybe a different scale. And this is one of the cases that I examine in my book. I look at the case of Hawassa, which is a very successful city in many ways, has grown rapidly. It's a city that's often highlighted within Ethiopia as having achieved not only rapid growth, but as a place that's desirable to live with. And it's really, I lived there with my family for a year. It's really a lovely city, very pleasant, and a place where a lot of new roads are being built. And roads at a micro scale have the same effect. If you build this much of the roads in Ethiopia and cities are not asphalt. And so if you come there, maybe dirt roads or gravel roads. So if you come in and you build an asphalt road, that creates a lot of new opportunity for investment, for development. It attracts local real estate developers. They're going to start building hotels, businesses, that sort of thing in those neighborhoods where the asphalt roads are. At the same time, asphalt requires a widening of the roads. So the case I look at in my book is one of the central city of Hawassa, where a new asphalt road is built in this central neighborhood. When the road is widened, the people who are living alongside that road quite literally are pushed out, displaced. Their homes are bulldozed, and they are granted a new space to live, but it's on the very outskirts of the city, literally an area that's known as Doro or Bata or chicken farm, because there's a big poultry farm out there, and really almost nothing else. So people that are accustomed to living right next to the market are suddenly on the outside of the city where they don't even speak, basically a rural area where they don't even speak the local language. In addition to that, that sort of direct displacement, you have the more long-term displacement. Rents rise. As this becomes a commercial area, people can't afford to live there anymore, and that also leads to a form of displacement from that city center and all the advantages that come with living in a central area: access to the informal market, access to small-scale entrepreneurial opportunities that are also destroyed. So there's this kind of cycle of destruction as well as construction. One more note about that I think maybe ties back into ways that of knowledge transfer from Ethiopia, from China to Ethiopia, is how the government has all of these things invite critique, right, from the people that are impacted from that. The Ethiopian government has taken a very strong hand in suppressing that critique up until recently. And so that one of the ways they've done that is to regulate and censor social media as well as internet use. And certain technologies for that have been adopted from China. Another way they've done that is from this, what's called the 5-to-1 system, where basically you have one person that is supervising 5 people or 5 families, and that reports up to, and that person will then, 5 of those people will report up to one person. And so it's a very kind of grassroots mode of information gathering and surveillance that happens in cities as well, that is a way of suppressing critique and making sure that any opposition to this construction is minimized.
That's very fascinating. And and you briefly touched, but in the book you discuss more, especially the section on the importance of different infrastructure technologies. Now, in the development economics literature, there's this old tradition which has been revived back in the last 10 years, perhaps, about that question, how the choice of technology adoption and how it is endogenous to existing productive capabilities, but also who is adapting, who is making the decision-making there. For example, should you tilt the land with traditional methods or get a tractor that was built and designed for Kansas soil structure, right? And there's some work on that, for example, how tractors imported from the north, particularly the United States, was destroying the agricultural production in the south, especially around the tropics, because the soil structure was a lot different. It wasn't deep, it was very shallow. So when you tilt the land very deep, that was destroying the fertility and all that and making you more reliant on artificial fertilizers, particularly. And also over time, long-term productivity of the land was diminishing. Now, I had this similar aha moment when you were discussing about the cobblestones. And that is similar to also manufacturing processes, like in textiles, for example. The Chinese-made machinery usually is a lot less high-tech. Maybe they are second or third best technologies. And in the economics literature, usually you have this fight back and forth. Well, they are second and third best. They are not the technology frontier, but maybe they are more suitable for the needs because they can be easier to maintain, improvise, teach, adapt, learn how to operate and improve. So is cobblestone a similar process? Like, what do you mean with this in the infrastructure projects? What kind of different technologies have different type of advantages? Can you walk us through like some of the main building blocks there and how they ended up making those decisions?
Yeah. I mean, the cobblestone case is fascinating and a really interesting one. And yeah, from a theoretical level on development technology, I start off with this And within anthropology, I think one of the key texts is James Ferguson's Anti-Politics Machine, where he critiques this idea that you can just come in with a technological innovation and that will solve problems of development. And he argues that this takes away from politics, right? And that the politics of redistribution of wealth, and that's very important. And then maybe the counter argument to that that's been raised by anthropologists more recently is that technologies in themselves are political, like the example that you mentioned of the plows. You bring in a giant tractor, and that technology brings in a certain politics, a certain form of redistribution that goes along with that. And so some anthropologists have argued that technologies in themselves almost have a form of agency in that sense because they have such an impact. And so one of the terms that's been used within anthropology is vital materialism, this notion that materials have a certain vitality and certain political implications. And so I've responded to that arguing, okay, that's a great argument, but then we also need to think about the kind of classic Marxist notion of that historical materialism and combine kind of a vital materialism with a historical materialism when we look at these technologies. So looking at both what the technologies do as well as how the technologies rearrange or refigure labor relationships. And cobblestone is a particularly interesting example of that. So cobblestone roads are not traditional in Ethiopia. They're fairly new. They've been introduced in the past 10 years, and they started with the German development corporation, the GTZ, as it's called in Germany. Of course, cobblestone's been in Germany for a long time, and the story is that Ethiopian minister was actually traveling in Europe, saw these cobblestone roads, like, "What? This is great. Why don't we do this? We could be building cobblestone roads." Got together with leaders from the GTZ, and they sent some some German craftsmen to Ethiopia to start teaching this, and it gradually spread from there with a heavy amount of state investment as well as funding support from GTZ. So by the time that I was doing this research around 2015, at that point already well over 100,000 jobs had been created building cobblestone roads in Ethiopian cities. And so this is a case where definitely that technology is specifically related to job creation, right? It's a form of slow growth, slow construction that really contrasts with asphalt roads and the hydroelectric dams as well. And so the technology in itself, the use of that technology generates all kinds of jobs. Now, in addition to that, it's the promoters of the cobblestone also argue that it supports government transparency and undermines corruption as well, because number one, the contracts are much smaller. So it's easier for government administrators who, as decentralization occurs, and government administrators who maybe don't have a lot of experience with handling construction contracts to deal with those. Also, the level of transparency in the sense that these are administered at the local level. And so communities who are watching this process can report directly to their local administrators if they're seeing problems with this, unlike the hydroelectric dams where billions of dollars are at stake and no one is allowed around that construction at all. So far more transparency in that process. So that technology also contributes to that. It's also a local material. It's comes from quarries that are local as well. So it creates jobs in that sense, as well as using local materials, cuts down on sort of carbon costs of building this infrastructure as well. And slow also in terms of the vehicles, slows down vehicles. Most Ethiopians don't own private vehicles, and so there's no need really for asphalt roads are really valuable only for the few people that own cars and then for transporting goods over long distances. Cobblestone roads work quite well for pedestrians, that sort of thing.
And I
So on one hand,
sorry for interrupting, but I can think also many other benefits probably that would come up that when you are describing it, including a larger multiplier effect, but it is not import dependent, right? It's produced with and maintained with local technologies and capacities, like with asphalt roads for an import dependent country, especially in oil, that is constant consumption and imports of and leakage from the economy, domestic economy to abroad. But I did not think of that corruption part. I think you're absolutely right that it has a much smaller corruption impact, given that it's a lot more transparent and you have fewer layers of contractors or subcontractors in between, unlike in an asphalt road case.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. And and as I said, also just the accountability. People can go and they can talk to their local administrators. They can see what's happening with this. And then I guess the other big benefit, if you've ever experienced an asphalt road that was built, a brand new road, it looks beautiful, and then 2 or 3 years later, which I mean, I have direct experience of this in Ethiopia, full of potholes. And if you want to refurbish that asphalt road, it often requires tearing it up completely, starting fresh, very expensive to repair that asphalt road. And an asphalt road that's full of potholes is actually, in my opinion, worse than just a gravel road, because you have to go so slow, or you're just damaging your vehicles. And it's dangerous as well. Whereas cobblestone is much easier to patch, much easier to repair. The other thing I was going to say about the asphalt, the cobblestone that's interesting is, so I was saying about, so the kind of the combination between labor relations and the materials itself. So the material of the cobblestone does a lot, but the labor relations are also very important for why cobblestone is so successful. The cobblestone roads are constructed by workers' cooperatives. So unemployed young people organize themselves into cooperatives that are then, and then they compete for contracts that are offered by the local governments. And so what that means is the profits from these contracts are shared among the people that are chiseling the stones, setting the stones, that sort of thing. So it's much more lucrative in terms of being a laborer on these cobblestone roads than being a laborer on an asphalt road. I mean, you could imagine if hydroelectric dams were built by workers' cooperatives, those billions of dollars, and most of these dams, many of the dams are actually built by one particular Italian company, Salini, in Ethiopia. And if you could imagine if instead of those billions going to that company, Italian company, if it were distributed among the workers, that transformation would be entirely different. And with one of the things I'm able to discuss in this book is, because my previous work was on unemployed youth, I've actually followed some of them for now a period of 10 to 15 years. Some of these young people, young men specifically, who were unemployed for many years in the early 2000s, eventually found work in those cobblestone cooperatives, running those cooperatives. And young people who, without a high school education and with very little skills training, have made significant improvements in their lives. And in Ethiopia, improvements are oftentimes conceptualized in terms of how you help your families, how you help others. And so these young men, when I speak to them, have a great deal of pride in describing creating small business opportunities for their friends or their family members with the small amounts of money that they're able to work to earn from the cobblestone sector. So that's really an important thing. And without those cooperatives, I don't think those profits would be the same. I think that the tensions between the state and the cobblestone sector would be much greater than they have been. So the organization of labor within the cobblestone sector is, in my opinion, as important as the materials, and that's really led to the major transformations. And people kind of using that as a base, then to start other small businesses that come out of that, and then eventually to just independence. I mean, one of the things I talked about in my first book was young people, quote unquote, but being 30, 40, still living with their parents, still dependent on their parents because of long-term unemployment. And so being able to move out of that and to be independent and eventually help one's family is a major life change for these folks.
And you briefly talked, and I think that's the elephant in the room, right? This giant hydroelectric dams and those projects. And in your book, you kind of affiliate hydropower, particularly with Renaissance, rebirth, and reawakening. That's usually not the terms in which we think of, right? Hydroelectric dams. Like what's the connection? How do you link it with this Renaissance and rebirth, or how do they do it with awakening? Is that a government policy of its marketing, or it's actually indigenous way of looking at those projects?
Well, that's the language of the Ethiopian state. That's what I wanted to add a couple of slides I wanted to share just to show you. And so what I'm going to show you here is the first one is a government poster that features basically a collage of different infrastructural technologies. At the top it says Hig Megstachen Hidsachen, which essentially means our constitution for our Renaissance. And in what this poster shows is various infrastructural projects. So one is the massive dam that's actually called the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. That's really the language of the state, as well as bullet train, wind wind propellers for generating wind, that sort of thing. And so this type of propaganda is quite common. The other is a poster of the late Meles Zenawi and some children, and another picture of the of the massive grand Ethiopian Renaissance dam, and it shows Meles kind of pointing out into the future. And the translation is something along the lines as we will fulfill the promises of our great father. So this is after he passed away, and so definitely this vision of the future, of a reawakening, of rebirth. I mean, the grand Ethiopian Renaissance dam is, the word Renaissance is right there, and that is the biggest dam project in Ethiopia. That's the dam that's being built on the Nile River that then flows into Sudan and into Egypt. And so the idea of Renaissance, of course, is not just something new, but this rebirth, reawakening, which appeals to Ethiopia's history as a country that was never colonized, a country that was one of the most powerful civilizations in the entire region during the Aksumite era, that constructed the massive stone churches of Lalibela. And so the idea that hydropower is kind of the next step in that process. It's also, I think, related to ownership of the Nile River as well. And the Nile River, the Blue Nile, originates in Ethiopia, and sort of a reclamation of this as a heritage, Ethiopian heritage, and something that they have the rights to, and that can be used to promote development. So this combination, I mean, all of these images are intended to associate the ruling party, or what was the ruling party at that time, with hydroelectricity, with infrastructure, with the bigger policies that are associated with that constitution, and with rebirth in the form of economic growth, building up a new country, and all of those things that I mentioned before. Cheap hydropower, in theory, creates the jobs. I mean, if all of these hydroelectric projects are successful, hydropower would be Ethiopia's largest export, as opposed to its current exports, which are all basically agricultural products, raw materials, coffee, and other agricultural products. So a major transformation in Ethiopia's economy. And then there's just the symbolic dimensions of these feats of engineering. Some of the biggest hydroelectric dams in Africa, if not the world, are being built in Ethiopia. And I think those types of symbolic dimensions have been seen. Do we see that in India during the post-independence period around hydroelectric dams in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s? There's really this kind of return to this imagery of moving forward, progress, of the future that goes along with hydropower.
Yeah, really fascinating. Now, maybe to link this with the social transformation, and you discuss at length, but can you walk us through in what ways what infrastructure and in general construction projects are transforming the political and social landscape in the cities, and also maybe the countryside, and in what ways that is similar to other global South countries perhaps, but we can focus just on Ethiopia. How is that affecting the social and political transformation? Maybe is it linked currently when the ethnic conflicts between different parts? But overall, how Ethiopia is different today than it was, say, 20 years ago?
Right. Well, it's in terms of social transformation, I think one of the interesting things that comes out of this is, so just one kind of interesting comparison. 20 years ago, or even so, my first research project, I did research between 2003, 2005 on unemployment. And when I would talk to young people at that time about their desires for the future, the type of work that they wanted, it was often government jobs, government bureaucratic jobs, especially those who were educated, saw themselves working in a bureaucracy. And many of the most respected people in the city were those that were involved at the upper levels of the government. Those were the people that were the leaders, community leaders, you could say, in a sense, within a medium-sized city. In the more recent project, where I was conducted primarily between 2013 2014, in addition to some short-term research before and after that, contractors, construction contractors, I should say, were the most powerful people and were the community leaders. And so it's actually the builders themselves are the new leaders. And no one wants to work as a government bureaucrat any longer. Very few people want to work as government bureaucrats any longer. Those jobs are seen as paying very little and having very little local power, limited power as well. And so that construction sector has in some ways become the locus of power at a local level. So that's one major transformation. And then also, as I said before, just the degree to which opportunities at lower levels are increasingly associated and connected with construction. And just the day-to-day sort of bombardment almost with the images of growth, images of construction, images of development, which I think for a lot of people can become very exhausting. I mean, despite Ethiopia's rapid economic growth, the people that I know, the people that you talk to on a day-to-day level in the cities, they don't see their lives transformed by this. I think this is something that's really important to emphasize, is that Ethiopia has been declared as kind of this African lion, type of Africa rising, and the numbers that I said at the beginning of our talk are truly impressive, but the vast majority of the population is still struggling. Their day-to-day conversations are, are we going to be able to eat 3 meals a day? The inflation during this period of growth has been extremely rapid. And that's also one of the reasons why people don't want government jobs, is because government jobs don't keep up with inflation. But food prices, beginning in 2008, increased dramatically. So this is the sort of day-to-day reality that people are dealing with. And so when they see these images of the massive dams, of the new asphalt roads, they may generate some initial excitement, in the sense that this is something new, it's a sign of progress, but people are not feeling a rebirth or reawakening. There are some, like I mentioned before, that have gotten involved with the cobblestone projects or other combinations of construction and development work and have seen their lives transformed. But I would not say that those are the majority by any means. Certainly, there's more opportunities like that than there were in 2003 or 2004. But the vast majority of people are still, struggling with their day-to-day lives.
This is very interesting, Dan. Thank you very much. I think our listeners also really appreciate it a lot. It's very interesting, and I encourage everybody to take a look at your book, which is a fascinating story. I will definitely talk to you more about it after this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for taking the time to chat, and hope people, I also encourage you to check out my book. And it's published 2019 with Duke Press, so you can look it up under construction, technology of development in urban Ethiopia. And if anybody ever assigns it to your class, I'm always happy to zoom in to give a talk or chat with your students about it as well.